Welcome back. More Bush League justice tonight. A brand new report from the House Armed Services Committee skewers the Bush administration over its unprecedented use of so-called signing statements. Since he took office, President Bush has been regularly attaching conditions to laws already passed by Congress, allowing him to essentially circumvent the will of Congress and dramatically expand the president's power. The report found, quote, this president has issued a significantly larger percentage of signing statements challenging or objecting to various provisions of the law. 78% of President Bush's signing statements have raised constitutional or legal objections, compared with only 18% of all of President Clinton's. Joining me now is Catherine Crier, former judge, and back with us is Roy Sekoff. Catherine, this is a big deal.
It's a very big deal. I actually had a chance to interview Sandra Day O'Connor shortly after she left the bench, and I asked her specifically about signing statements. She wouldn't give me an advisory opinion, but she made it clear, number one, it's never come before the Supreme Court, and number two, that she had a lot of questions about them. Legislation is the legislative branch's function. Review is the judiciary branch's function, and the executive branch can't go manipulating the laws. I think if it ever came before the Supreme Court, we'd get a very definitive opinion that this is not appropriate.
I'm going to read an example of what the law was and then what Bush's signing statements did to undermine the law. This is basically a signing statement which reduces the impact of law to protect whistleblowers. All right? The Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and its contractors may not fire or otherwise punish an employee whistleblower who tells Congress about possible wrongdoing. All right? Pretty clear. Well, here's what Bush adds to it, right? So the law gets passed, then the president signs it, and he adds this to it. He says, the president or his appointees will determine whether employees of the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can give information to Congress. I mean, Catherine, that essentially says whatever's in the law, don't really pay attention to it because we decide what they can or can't say.
And the biggest problem with it, Dan, is the fact that the president is then directing the agency affected by the law how to act. And unless there comes time that the issue is then confrontable by Congress or the courts, he can go on directing this sort of behavior indefinitely, and that's what's occurred during this administration. So you have to have a confrontation of sorts over misexecution of the law to bring it to the fore so the American people, oftentimes Congress, don't really know how these laws are being executed, certainly contrary to the intent of the legislature.
You know, Roy, why not more outrage on this topic?
Well, that's the other thing about this, Dan. I mean, the hard thing to stomach is it's yet another hard-hitting congressional report with no teeth to it. I mean, they tell us something we already know, and it's like, you know, they've done all these horrible things, they've subverted the Constitution, and what are we going to do about it? We're going to issue a report saying they've subverted the Constitution. So it's sort of like yet another reason why America hates Washington.
Catherine, what should they do? What should Congress? I mean, this is outrageous. What should Congress do?
Well, you would think there would be an avenue either through an investigative committee dealing with a specific legislation, you know, something to say if the agencies are not enacting this legislation as they have been directed, that there is a means by which to ensure that occurs. And unless they find a case specifically that could go to the courts, you're never going to have a judicial determination, which is pretty difficult when you're dealing with sort of a political question in this fashion. But I would think you could find legislation that has been specifically manipulated that would give rise to that.
But you know, the big picture here, Dan, is that George Bush came to town promising to change the culture of Washington, and in fact he has, for the worse.
Catherine Crier and Roy Sekoff, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Vaya con Dios, Dan.
Tell me, what is your name? MC Rove.
Since this is the final episode of Verdict, I'm guessing this man, Karl Rove, is probably dancing, celebrating. We launched the Bush League Justice Series back in December based on my outrage at how the Bush administration politicized the usually apolitical Justice Department and along the way expanded its power at the cost of our system of checks and balances. Since then, we have uncovered and exposed many of the most egregious actions of this administration as it relates to the Justice Department. Which brings us back to Mr. Rove. For months, he has refused to answer questions both from me and, more importantly, under oath from Congress, about what role, if any, he played in the U.S. attorney scandal and, or the prosecution of a prominent former Democratic governor. Well, the courts have now ruled against the White House and indirectly, therefore, Mr. Rove. So while Congress may be unable or unwilling to hold him accountable, Rove may not remain immune for long. That would mean we could finally learn who was the driving force behind Bush League justice.